Vanessa's words cut through the air sharper than the slam of her suitcase lid. She shoved another dress inside, the hanger still attached, as though even pausing to remove it would cost her more than she was willing to give. The house smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender and citrus, but instead of sweet, it choked the room like smoke. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, spoon balanced over a bowl of oatmeal that had long gone cold. He didn't beg her to stay. He didn't even ask why. His silence had always been mistaken for weakness, and Vanessa thrived on that mistake. She slipped on oversized sunglasses, though the evening sun had already set, as if this was some kind of glamorous departure rather than the fracture of 15 years. She straightened her blazer, smirked, and delivered her final blow. "From now on, my defender will handle everything. You don't need to speak to me again." Her tone was smug, the kind of confidence people borrow from someone else's authority. The door closed with a click that sounded like wealth and finality. Upstairs, the faint scrape of her suitcase wheels on the stairs faded into silence. The dog cowered beneath the dining table, still rattled from when she had kicked his water bowl over in her tantrum. Ethan finally lowered his spoon, his expression as calm as stone. He rose slowly, like a man who had been waiting not for this moment specifically, but for the inevitability of it. He passed the flooded basement damage she had caused weeks ago and blamed on him and didn't bother to glance at it. He wasn't here to clean up anymore. Tonight he was here to open a door no one else even knew existed. In the garage, hidden behind a pegboard drilled with 3 false screws, lay a slim leather binder embossed with gold initials she had never noticed. Marital contingency. Revision 4A. Vanessa had spent years calling him uninteresting, unambitious, a man with no vision. Yet right here, behind the rusted tools and broken batteries, was vision laid out in meticulous pages. Ethan opened the binder to the section he had revisited every year on the same day: insurance for betrayal. The page was dense with legal text, footnotes and clauses that would bore anyone who skimmed it. But Ethan knew the line that mattered. Clause 7, highlighted in faint pencil, the delegation clause. The wording was simple. If Vanessa ever formally declared that all marital communication must be conducted solely through a third party, she forfeited her direct standing in their agreements. Tonight she had declared it word for word, and she had done so on record. The small black eye of the kitchen camera above the cabinets, its light long since switched to infrared, had captured the sentence perfectly. Vanessa believed it was off. She always underestimated details. Ethan didn't need to smile. His satisfaction was quieter than that. He slid the page into a fax machine tucked into the back of his office desk. Minutes later, his estate advisor responded with a single sheet hand-delivered to the side entrance. Proceed under Rev 4A approved. No theatrics. No flourish. Just validation. Ethan placed the documents back into their binder, closed the lock, and returned the disguise a dead drill battery clipped into place. Upstairs, Vanessa would already be sending her friends filtered selfies captioned "New Chapter." Fresh start? Perhaps she was laughing into her phone, wineglass in hand, thinking of the man she believed she had defeated. She thought silence meant surrender. She thought calmness meant collapse. What she never understood was that silence carries weight and calmness builds momentum. For those listening now who have ever been underestimated, who have ever been called powerless while they quietly carried every card, understand this: silence is not weakness. It is the first beat of strategy. If you've been that quiet person, hit subscribe, not for me, but because you know the feeling of being overlooked until it's too late for anyone else to catch up. The night closed around the house, and Ethan stood in his garage, binder sealed once again, heart steady. Vanessa had just triggered the one thing she should have feared most, a trap she didn't even know existed. And now the story had begun. Tell me in the comments if you were in Ethan's place. Would you reveal the truth immediately, or would you wait until every domino fell? The binder's edges were still warm beneath Ethan's hands when his memory drifted backward, back to the countless small moments that had carried him to this night. Years ago, when he had first introduced Vanessa to his work, he had placed a carefully drafted legal memo on the kitchen counter, a document that explained his role in managing compliance frameworks for a mid-sized financial group. She'd barely skimmed it before tossing it in the trash with a casual remark. "You're boring when you try to sound important." The sting of those words didn't come from anger, but from recognition. It wasn't the first time she had dismissed him, and it wouldn't be the last. Vanessa liked to be surrounded by noise lunches with friends, yoga classes where gossip spread faster than sweat, charity events that doubled as photo opportunities. Ethan, by contrast, thrived in silence. He spent late nights hunched over spreadsheets, memorizing obscure legal language, and consulting quietly with advisors she never met. To her, those nights looked like dull routines. To him, they were the scaffolding of a fortress she didn't know she was standing inside. Every time she mocked his quietness, every time she called him predictable or safe, he only tightened another bolt in the framework. She thought she was the one climbing higher. In truth, she was climbing a staircase he had built step by step, each plank reinforced with patience. The world outside might have seen him as passive, but Ethan knew better. Patience was not weakness, it was a weapon, sharpened by years of neglect and stored for moments exactly like this. And for those who've ever had their efforts belittled, you'll understand this being underestimated is sometimes the most powerful position of all. Subscribe now if you know what it means to build in silence while others laugh. Ethan remembered the dinners where Vanessa held court, retelling gossip with sparkling eyes, never once pausing to ask about his projects. He recalled how she corrected his outfits before social events, how she smirked when he drove their modest sedan into a parking lot lined with luxury imports, and how she teased him with the phrase, "Don't embarrass me by looking like a clerk." What she didn't see was that the very man she belittled was drafting revisions to their marital agreements, embedding clauses so subtle that even the most polished attorneys would glance past them. Ethan never argued back, never sought to win in the moment, because he wasn't playing for applause, he was playing for permanence. Vanessa thrived on instant victories. Ethan invested in inevitable ones. That contrast grew year after year, until the imbalance was so heavy that it only needed a single sentence, "My defender will handle you," to tip it all over. Now, as she reveled in her imagined freedom, sipping champagne somewhere under neon lights, Ethan stood steady in the knowledge that the trap was no accident. It was crafted by every moment she dismissed, every opportunity she ignored to truly know the man she had married. The irony was cruel but perfect. She thought silence meant he had nothing to say, when in truth it meant he had already spoken, just in a language of contracts and contingencies that she never cared to read. And now, for those of you listening, I want to know, have you ever been overlooked so badly that it turned into your advantage? Drop your answer in the comments, because your story might resonate with someone else quietly holding their own cards. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button for Fractured Promises so you never miss more powerful, true-to-life stories like this one. The night settled deep and quiet around the house, yet Ethan's thoughts were anything but still. He had memorized every clause in that binder long before tonight, but now, with Vanessa's words recorded and sealed into evidence, the paper carried a new weight. He remembered the day it had been drafted, years ago, in a corner office overlooking the city. The attorney who had helped him finalize it had leaned forward and said, "If she ever takes you for granted, these pages will speak louder than you ever could." At the time, Ethan had tucked the binder away, unsure if it would ever be necessary, but determined to be ready. He thought of all the evenings when Vanessa scrolled her phone at the dinner table, laughing at messages from her friends while he quietly revised legal documents under the glow of a desk lamp. She thought he was doing glorified data entry, never curious enough to ask why those late nights stretched so long. What she didn't know was that Ethan wasn't just preparing for business. He was preparing for survival. Every section in the binder told a story: provisions for asset control, clauses hidden between corporate restructuring language, even stipulations that tied financial authority to specific phrases. To Vanessa, the language would look like a forest of meaningless words. To Ethan, they were trigger wires. And she had just stepped on one. For years, she had underestimated the silence, rolled her eyes at his patience, mocked his unshakable calm. But now, those same traits had transformed into something unbreakable. That was the trap. Not a sudden twist, but a patient architecture of inevitability. And if you've ever built something quietly while others ignored you, then you know the power of waiting. Subscribe if you believe the best revenge isn't shouting, it's preparation. The fax confirmation still rested on the desk, its ink sharp and final. Ethan pictured Vanessa in some rooftop lounge, glass in hand, telling her friends that she was free, that her defender would reduce him to nothing. The irony of it all was almost poetic. She believed she had armed herself with protection, when in truth she had handed him a key. He could still see her smirk from earlier, that familiar look she gave waiters or store clerks, the one that said she believed she was above them. Tonight, that smirk had been her undoing. The moment she spoke those words, "Only my defender will handle you," the clause had sprung to life. In that instant, her voice had transformed from arrogance into authorization. Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't gloat. He simply filed the proof, stamped and sealed. To the outside world, nothing had changed. No slammed doors. No screaming arguments, no neighbors whispering about a dramatic breakup. But in reality, everything had shifted. Vanessa had just surrendered her position without realizing it. Ethan walked back into the kitchen, poured the untouched oatmeal down the sink, and rinsed the bowl with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't need to celebrate. The real satisfaction would come later, as one domino after another fell into place. For those listening right now, I want you to pause and think, what's more powerful, winning an argument in the moment or winning a war so quietly the other side never realizes until it's over? Let me know what you'd choose in the comments, because the answer says everything about how you fight your battles. Morning light filtered through the blinds, painting thin lines across the kitchen counter where Ethan had left his bowl the night before. By now, Vanessa had already uploaded a string of photographs, her lips curved in a triumphant smile, champagne glass in hand, rooftop skyline behind her. Each post dripped with the kind of arrogance only someone convinced of victory could muster. "Fresh start," one caption read. Another, paired with a wink emoji, promised her circle of friends that her so-called defender would make this the easiest separation anyone had ever witnessed. Ethan saw none of it. He didn't need to. He already knew how she operated. Predictable, performative, loud. She wanted the world to see her as powerful. She wanted Ethan to be invisible. What she didn't realize was that invisibility had been his strength all along. That morning, as she strutted into a renovated office complex where boutique law firms rubbed shoulders with juice bars and crystal shops, she carried herself like royalty. Her heels clicked against the marble floor while her oversized sunglasses remained fixed in place, as though paparazzi might spring from the elevator at any moment. She pushed through the glass doors of Daniel Harris and Associates, her defender's kingdom. Daniel himself fit her fantasy perfectly sharp suit, jawline polished by confidence, Yale crest flashing faintly from a screensaver on his desk. He welcomed her with a grin so practiced it felt like muscle memory. "No resistance," he said, tossing a folder onto the sleek table. He signed without revision. "No conditions, no fight." "Cleanest case I've had in years." Vanessa's laughter bubbled up, sharp and satisfied. She believed she had won. What neither she nor her defender realized was that the papers Daniel had dismissed as routine carried seeds of their own destruction. Ethan's patience wasn't just silent, it was surgical, and the operation had already begun. Subscribe now if you understand that sometimes the loudest confidence masks the deepest blindness. Ethan, meanwhile, was miles away in a modest office tucked behind a rural pharmacy, the kind of place no one visited unless necessity forced them, while Vanessa giggled into her phone, texting her lover about a future free of her boring husband. Ethan was sliding 2 notarized documents across a chipped counter. The notary, a woman whose glasses magnified her eyes like twin moons, squinted at the dense legal text. "Executive exception clause?" she murmured, tapping her pen against the paper. "Haven't seen one of these since the crash of '08, Ethan only nodded, expression steady, hands folded. He didn't explain because explanation wasn't necessary. The proof was already in his possession, a recorded phrase, a triggered clause, and a defender who had unknowingly walked straight into a cage Ethan had built years before. At that very hour, Vanessa leaned closer to Daniel's desk, her voice dripping with disdain. "See, I told you he wouldn't fight back. Pathetic, isn't he?" "Predictable as ever," Daniel smirked, stirring turmeric into his latte, utterly convinced he had secured another effortless victory. What he failed to see was that the ground beneath him had already shifted. Every signature he dismissed, every clause he skimmed, had teeth. Ethan had placed them there long ago in anticipation of this very arrogance. The beauty of a well-set trap is not in the moment it's built, but in the moment it's ignored. Vanessa thought she had chosen a champion, a man who would crush Ethan for her. Instead, she had handed her trust to someone already bound by the threads Ethan had tied. And while she celebrated her illusion of freedom, Ethan was watching, waiting, and preparing to turn that illusion into her downfall. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone laugh too soon, certain they had won when you knew the real ending was still waiting? Daniel Harris might have strutted through his glass-walled office with the swagger of a man who believed victory was already sealed. But across town, Ethan was quietly dismantling that illusion piece by piece. The defender hadn't read the fine print. He hadn't noticed the subtle provisions buried between lines of asset schedules. He hadn't questioned why Ethan signed without revision. To him, it meant weakness. To Ethan, it meant the curtain had finally been drawn. Vanessa, glowing in her self-satisfaction, never stopped to consider that Ethan had always been most dangerous when he appeared most compliant. While she bragged to her friends about Daniel's brilliance, Ethan was at a downtown records office, transferring asset control into pre-authorized trusts that were invisible to her claims. He spoke softly with clerks who barely glanced at him, stamping documents that shifted property lines like chess pieces. By the time Daniel was sipping his afternoon coffee, the ground had already moved. Ethan had redirected stock options, sealed off liquid accounts, and positioned his signatures like soldiers in formation. All of it silent, all of it legal. For years, he had listened to Vanessa's scorn, endured her laughter at his tedious paperwork, her eye rolls when he reviewed statements late into the night. What she never realized was that the tedium she despised was the very machinery of her undoing. Every ledger, every clause, every file folder she mocked had been bricks in the wall of her own confinement. And now those bricks were closing in around her. If you've ever watched arrogance blind someone to the obvious, then you know why Ethan didn't need to shout. He just needed to wait. Subscribe if you believe the strongest moves are made in silence, while others waste their strength in noise. Meanwhile, Daniel scheduled a call with Vanessa to assure her that everything was under control. She lounged on a velvet sofa, scrolling her phone as if the world were hers, barely listening as he spoke. She didn't notice the faint tremor in his voice, the hesitation between his words. Something in the paperwork wasn't lining up, but Daniel's pride wouldn't let him admit it. He promised her an effortless win, and to question that now would expose cracks in his armor. Ethan, on the other hand, was already tightening the threads. A single phone call to an investment partner pulled Ryan Pierce, the man Vanessa had been secretly seeing, into the storm. Ryan didn't know it yet, but his business accounts were intertwined with Vanessa's signatures. Ethan had set the trap so broadly that the moment Vanessa invoked her defender, Ryan's empire was tethered to the same noose. And while Vanessa texted him promises of vacations and victory, Ethan was holding the quiet scissors that would cut their plans apart. By sunset, Vanessa poured another drink, Daniel polished his cufflinks, and Ryan made dinner reservations for two. Each of them celebrated in their own way, blind to the fact that Ethan's hand was on every string, pulling tighter with every hour. They thought the stage belonged to them. They didn't see that Ethan was the playwright, and they were just characters speaking lines he had written years before. Tell me in the comments, what do you think is more dangerous? A man who shouts his intentions, or one who hides them so well that by the time you notice, the play is already over? Ryan Pierce always imagined himself untouchable. His startup was valued in the tens of millions. Investors hailed him as the next great disruptor, and Vanessa's adoration only inflated his sense of invincibility. He saw Ethan as a washed-up husband, a dull man left behind. And Daniel, the so-called defender, had promised a clean break that would leave Ryan and Vanessa free to flaunt their new life. But behind the scenes, Ethan had already tied Ryan's empire to Vanessa's arrogance. The contracts she signed, the careless delegation to her attorney, the smug dismissal of Ethan's silence, all of it cascaded toward Ryan's world like an avalanche. One morning, as Ryan prepared for a high-profile investor meeting, his assistant rushed in pale-faced, waving a letter stamped with urgency. It was a notice of compliance review, citing a morality clause buried in his Series B funding agreements. At first, Ryan laughed it off, standard procedure, just a formality. But then his phone began to buzz nonstop. 3 venture firms had suspended their commitments. His inbox filled with messages marked urgent. His CFO demanded an explanation. And Ryan, once the golden boy, realized he had walked into a minefield he never saw being planted. Ethan had said it years earlier, camouflaged between clauses Ryan's lawyers had skimmed and ignored. Now the blast was detonating. The investors didn't care about excuses. They saw exposure, risk, and a man compromised through his personal entanglement with Vanessa. By the time he stood at the boardroom table, the men who once toasted his brilliance now eyed him like a liability. Across town, Vanessa was laughing over brunch, snapping photos for social media with captions like, "Freedom feels good?" She didn't know Ryan's company was burning down in real time. She didn't know Ethan had already pushed the dominoes that connected her betrayal to Ryan's collapse. And she didn't know the cruelest cut of all that. Ethan sat quietly on the advisory board of one of Ryan's key investors. He never raised his voice, never stormed into a room, never issued threats. He simply let the paper trail speak for him. And that trail now painted Ryan as unstable, conflicted, and untrustworthy. By the end of the week, Ryan's resignation was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. The press release was cold and efficient, effective immediately. Ryan Pierce steps down as CEO. Vanessa saw it on her phone while shopping for clothes she couldn't afford on credit cards already flagged for review. Her stomach dropped. Ryan stopped answering her calls. The man who promised her a kingdom had vanished into damage control, leaving her stranded. Ethan, meanwhile, didn't gloat. He didn't even watch the fallout with satisfaction. He had prepared, positioned, and allowed gravity to do the work. This wasn't revenge. It was inevitability. And Vanessa was about to realize she hadn't just lost a marriage, she had destroyed the only safety net she thought she had. Tell me in the comments, if you were in Ethan's place, would you have let Ryan fall silently, or would you have confronted him face to face to watch the collapse? Daniel Weston prided himself on being unshakable. In every courtroom he entered, clients whispered his name like a spell that guaranteed victory. His tailored suits, the swagger in his stride, the way he reduced opponents to rubble with cross-examinations, all of it built the illusion of a man who could not be cornered. When Vanessa stormed into his office months earlier, promising him an easy case against her predictable husband, he smiled and saw nothing but billable hours and another easy win. What he didn't realize was that Ethan had written Daniel into the script years before, and Daniel was now playing the role of a man already defeated. The first crack appeared when the sealed envelope arrived. No flourish, no warning, just a delivery stamped with Ethan's signature. Daniel opened it, read the filings inside, and for the first time in a long time, felt his throat tighten. He scanned the pages again and again, each line of legal architecture revealing that Ethan wasn't some hapless spouse, he was the founder, trustee, and architect of a network of holdings worth millions. Daniel knew instantly what it meant. He hadn't just overlooked a detail, he had missed the entire game. He called Vanessa in a panic, demanding answers, but her laughter on the other end of the line chilled him. She insisted Ethan was just a file clerk with coupons and cheap shoes. Daniel wanted to believe her, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The final blow came when a judge, one Daniel knew personally, validated Ethan's filings without hesitation. Judicial approval, airtight compliance, notarized signatures all confirming what Daniel had feared. His opponent wasn't a fool, but a strategist who had been 10 steps ahead. Worse, Daniel realized his own reputation was now at stake. The investors linked to Ryan's collapse began whispering about negligence. Other lawyers he played golf with asked uncomfortable questions. His assistant noticed the whiskey bottle in his drawer emptying faster than usual. He replayed the moment Vanessa first walked into his office, all fury and arrogance, and realized he should have walked away. But greed had tethered him to her, and now that tether was strangling his career. When the resignation letter from Ryan Pierce went public, Daniel knew the walls were closing in. His so-called triumph had turned into a public humiliation, his client exposed, his strategy shredded, and his own credibility in ruins. Vanessa called again, demanding a fix, her voice shrill with panic. He didn't answer. For the first time in his career, Daniel wasn't defending, he was running. Tell me in the comments, do you think Daniel deserved to fall for his arrogance, or should Ethan have shown him mercy once the trap was sprung? Vanessa always believed she would land on her feet. Even when she stormed out of Ethan's home, shoving dresses into a suitcase with the arrogance of someone untouchable, she imagined herself dining in rooftop cafes, wrapped in luxury, admired by a new circle of friends. For a time, she played the part, posting photos of cocktails, snapping selfies with Ryan, flaunting a lifestyle that screamed victory. But illusions have a way of shattering without warning. It began with small inconveniences: a credit card declined at a boutique, a landlord leaving curt voicemails about overdue condo fees, her closest friends quietly removing her from group chats. Then came the silence, the heavy, suffocating kind that gnaws at the edges of confidence. Ryan no longer returned her calls, his empire reduced to ashes. Daniel, once so proud, had gone quiet too, his name whispered now, not with respect but ridicule. The allies she trusted had vanished, leaving only a woman staring at her reflection. Makeup smudged, confidence cracked, and the gnawing realization that she had no one left to call. She tried her mother, hoping for comfort, but the only words she received were cold and damning. "What did you do to him?" Vanessa hung up, trembling. She had always painted Ethan as simple, predictable, safe background noise in her glamorous narrative. Now, stripped of her wealth, her reputation, and her allies, she realized he had been the gravity holding everything together. Without him, she was adrift, floating alone in the silence she once mocked. One evening, desperate for distraction, Vanessa turned on the television. A gala broadcast filled the screen, men in tuxedos, women in sequined gowns, champagne glasses glittering under chandeliers. Then she heard his name. Tonight's keynote will be delivered by Ethan Caldwell, incoming board chair of the Harrington Foundation. The camera panned, and there he was, calm, poised, speaking with the quiet authority she had always dismissed. His words weren't cruel or vengeful. They were about patience, about building quietly until others mistake silence for weakness, and about the power of those who don't need applause to prove their worth. Vanessa's chest tightened. She stepped closer to the screen, her wineglass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor, red seeping into the carpet like the final stain of her arrogance. She wanted to scream, to call someone, anyone, but her phone sat lifeless on the counter. No new messages, no missed calls, no allies left to answer. Ethan had never raised his voice, never chased her down. He had simply let her walk herself to the edge and step off. The silence was complete now, not a pause but a sentence. And Vanessa, once the woman who demanded the world bend to her whims, sat barefoot in her empty condo, finally understanding that she hadn't just lost a husband. She had lost the world she thought she controlled. Tell me in the comments, do you think Vanessa deserved the silence she ended up with, or was the price she paid too steep for the arrogance she carried? The days after Ethan's public emergence stretched endlessly for Vanessa. She tried to cling to whatever fragments of her old life remained, but each attempt revealed only more emptiness. Her accounts were frozen, her so-called friends had turned distant, and every place she once frequented now seemed hostile. At the yoga studio she used to boast about, no one met her eyes. Whispers followed her out the door. At the cafe where she once ordered the most expensive wine, the staff now treated her like an inconvenience. Silence had become her shadow, not the quiet she once mocked Ethan for, but the suffocating kind that presses in until you feel you're drowning in it. She scrolled endlessly through old photos, dinners, vacations, smiling faces beside hers, yet each image now looked staged, hollow, like a costume party for a role she no longer played. She thought of Ethan, not with longing, but with a crushing sense of regret. She had dismissed his patience as weakness, his composure as simplicity. Now she understood that silence could be strategy and stillness could be strength. It haunted her more than anger ever could, because anger at least would have meant she still mattered to him. Meanwhile, Ethan carried on without a glance back. In his new position, his name surfaced in boardrooms, in articles, in whispered circles of influence where Vanessa had never once been invited. He never gloated publicly, never mentioned her name, never corrected the stories she once told to paint him as a man of mediocrity. His silence cut deeper than words because it erased her. She had wanted to win the war of perception, to prove she was the one in control. But the world no longer even associated her with Ethan. She was not the woman who outmaneuvered a quiet husband. She was just forgotten, replaced by headlines that now celebrated him. And in that forgetting lay the cruelest revenge of all, not fury, not confrontation, but irrelevance. Vanessa sat in her empty condo, staring out at a city alive with lights she no longer touched. And for the first time in her life, she whispered the words she had never dared admit. I lost. Tell me in the comments, what do you think cuts deeper, explosive revenge that leaves scars, or a silent revenge that erases someone completely? Ethan Caldwell had never thought of himself as a man who craved revenge. For most of his life, he avoided conflict, endured barbs, and wore the mask of simplicity. But as he stood in his new office overlooking the skyline, the city humming below him, he realized that silence had always been his greatest ally. Silence gave him space to listen, to plan, to build when no one cared to watch. For years, Vanessa mocked that silence, called it dullness, treated it as a void she could fill with her noise. What she never understood was that silence isn't emptiness, it's structure. It's foundation. It's the scaffolding of patience that allows a man to outlast arrogance. The contracts, the clauses, the layers of protection he'd built were not acts of vengeance. They were acts of survival, of preparation. He never set out to ruin Vanessa, Ryan, or Daniel. They ruined themselves by underestimating the very man they dismissed. As Ethan reviewed the board minutes stamped with his approval, he felt no triumph, only a measured calm. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't broken a single law, hadn't even demanded recognition. He had simply allowed gravity to work, and those who ignored it had fallen. That evening, he left the office quietly, taking the back stairwell like he always did. Outside, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. He walked without entourage, without flashing cameras, without the trappings of power Vanessa once obsessed over. He stopped by a small bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a bakery, a place no one from his new boardroom circles would ever notice. The clerk recognized him faintly but said nothing. Ethan bought 2 novels, paid in cash, and left without fuss. That was who he had always been, not the figurehead Vanessa tried to caricature, but a man who built his life on subtlety. As he sat later in his modest apartment, the dog resting its head on his knee, Ethan thought of the life he had left behind. There was no anger, no bitterness, only clarity. Vanessa had chosen arrogance over humility, noise over listening, and allies who promised power but crumbled under pressure. Ryan had built an empire without safeguards, thinking charm could outlast structure. Daniel had relied on reputation, assuming past victories would shield him from future failures. All 3 had been undone by the same mistake, underestimating the quiet man. Ethan didn't smile as he thought it. He only exhaled, grateful that his silence had carried him further than their noise ever could. Ethan knew his story would never be told in tabloids or gossip circles the way Vanessa once craved. There would be no viral photos of his victory, no dramatic soundbites. His wins were in the margins, in the clauses, in the foundations others overlooked. And maybe that was the point. Revenge, in its loudest form, fades into spectacle. But justice, when it comes quietly, reshapes everything without needing applause. Ethan reached for his notebook, scribbling a few lines in his neat handwriting, not plans for another clause, not schemes for another defense, but a reminder to himself. Patience isn't weakness. Preparation isn't paranoia. And silence isn't surrender, it's power. He closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the room fill with stillness. Somewhere across the city, Vanessa might have been pacing her condo, Ryan might have been nursing his losses, and Daniel might have been drowning in professional shame. But here, in this small, unremarkable room, Ethan found what none of them ever had: peace. And as you finish hearing his story, I want to ask you, what would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you have stayed silent and let arrogance destroy itself? Or would you have chosen confrontation, demanding the world see your power? Share your thoughts below, because your perspective might just reveal what silence means to you. This was today's story. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to Fractured Promises. In the next story, we'll uncover another hidden truth. Remember, behind every broken promise lies a lesson.